fundamental assault on freedom of the press. That is the way to summarize the persecution of Julian Assange. It began in 2010 after the publication of the Iraqi war logs. These were files allegedly provided by Chelsea Manning to WikiLeaks. That's an important thing to remember. Unlike Daniel Ellsberg, Julian did not actually leak the files. He functioned in the traditional role of a publisher, a whistleblower, somebody who saw malfeasance and crimes being committed in the darkness of the government apparatus, decided that those crimes should be provided or made known to the public. The content was massive and highly embarrassing to the US government because it exposed not only war crimes, but the lies that had been spewed out to sustain the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the torture, the high number of civilian deaths, which they were covering up, etc. And so the assault began almost immediately. Michael Ratner and Len Weinglass. So they asked for a meeting with Julian, and they said that they feared that the U.S. government would come after Julian with the use of the Espionage Act. And Julian's answer was, come after me for what? And that started this long, tragic, horrific kind of judicial farce that has been going on ever since. It was clear that Julian would be extradited. I won't get into the whole Swedish complications, but the manipulation of Swedish law, charges against Julian that were false, etc. He took refuge for 7 years in the Ecuadorian embassy. The government changed, so he no longer had a government that was willing to grant him or continue to grant him asylum. They allowed the British Metropolitan Police to break in. He was hauled before a court. Now, the only crime they could charge him with was skipping bail, because by going into the embassy, he'd skipped bail. But nevertheless, they put him in a high security prison where he's been held now for over 5 years. And that whole those court cases, some of which I have attended in London, others of which I have followed online, have just eviscerated the most basic tenets of due process. Thrown out, they refused to classify him. UC Global, the Spanish security firm in the embassy, videotaped or made audio tapes of all of his meetings with his attorneys, which eviscerates attorney-client privilege. That alone should see the case. As a journalist, he's not an American citizen. WikiLeaks is not a US-based publication. How can you even use the Espionage Act, a 1917 act passed by Woodrow Wilson, ostensibly to go after people who provided information to the enemy, or the rough equivalent of the British Foreign Secrets Act, but in fact it was used almost immediately against dissidents, including that and the Sedition Act, including throwing Eugene V. Debs, the socialist candidate, into prison, shutting down big publications, Appeal to Reason, the Masses, etc. And so the anomalies within the case have been so egregious that I think quite consciously the British judicial system has made it very hard to cover. They've restricted the amount of people who get into the courtroom. Oftentimes when we pulled up links, we had no audio, we couldn't hear, there was no connection. I was in the courtroom for the 2-day hearing. This was his final appeal. There was roughly 2 or 3 dozen people allowed in, and in this new upcoming hearing on the 20th, they're not allowing any links outside of the UK and maybe Wales or something. I think even if you're in Scotland, you can't get it. So there's been a real effort to cover it up, because it is, anybody who looks at the details, it's a horrific judicial embarrassment. He was in the high court. The extradition request, Judge Pulitzer denied it because of Julian's very precarious mental and physical health, as anybody who would endure the torture that he's been under, or what Niels Melzer, the former special rapporteur on torture for the UN, called slow motion execution. And so they didn't extradite him based on the draconian conditions in the American prison system, which are very real. I teach in the prison system through Rutgers University, but they accepted all the other points. So Julian was allowed to, the United States government filed an appeal. That appeal was accepted. Then Julian went before a 2-judge panel. That was the last time he was in court. Well, he wasn't physically in the court, but went before the 2-judge panel, and they ruled whether he could appeal that final extradition request. They allowed him to do so on 2 points, minor points, I would say. legally, and that is, of course, where we are. We should also say that the court accepted a diplomatic note, it has no legal validity, which gave assurances that Julian would be well treated in the prison system. He would not be sent to a supermax prison. They wouldn't use what they call special administrative measures or SAMs against him. This diplomatic note has no validity. There was an escape clause that said, if he violates the rules, well, so who runs the rules? Who decides what the rules are? And then just on the legal aspect, I would also say that the demand for extradition came after the release of something known as Vault 7. Vault 7, published by WikiLeaks, exposed the CIA's hacking tools into telephones, cars, etc., even when they're turned off as kind of monitoring devices. But that's not part of the extradition request. But there's no question that if he was extradited, that would be added. He's facing 175 years in prison. He's being sent to the Eastern District Court in Virginia, which is where these quote-unquote terrorism cases, national security cases go, because they're all hanging judges. Gordon Kromberg was one who was quoted extensively in the court. And then just to close, I would say that as a journalist, this is devastating to those of us, such as myself, who have possessed classified documents. I did. I published them in the New York Times. It would set a legal precedent whereby any journalist who possessed these documents, just possessed them, didn't even publish them, it would be criminalized, much less, of course, publishing. It's the end of investigative journalism as we know it. And that's why, even with some reticence, the major publications, the New York Times, El País, The Guardian, published a joint letter demanding that Julian not be extradited. We won't get into the animus that they had and have towards Julian or why, but that essentially in a brief summary lays out, what they've done to him and the very, very, very real danger those of us who are journalists face.
We have to celebrate those